Today we're going to work on the thruster assemblies. The thruster assemblies are made up of small electrical motors that we attach propellers to. Because the Sea Perch is an underwater vehicle, we need to do some work to waterproof these engines to prevent water from getting in and shorting out the engines. The way we do that is we place them in these canisters and then use wax to seal them. So the first part about this is working to keep the wax out of the motors. We do that using electrical tape. Tape off all the holes in the motor. Alright, to tape up the motors, we take small pieces of tape and work our way around the shaft and bushing area of the motor. Once you have the pieces of tape covering up all of the holes, use a pair of scissors to trim off the excess. Okay. And do the same thing for the other side of your motor, not forgetting to mark the tab next to the red dot so that after it's wrapped we can still identify the positive pole of the motor. And then again on this side, putting pieces of tape around, and you'll need to get the tabs to punch through the tape just by pulling it down and over. Okay. And then again use the scissors to trim that. Once you have the two ends taped off, the rest is done by wrapping the motor with your electrical tape. As you do it, keep it pulled tight and it will keep the tape nice and smooth. And you want to get full coverage over all of the holes on the motor to ensure that then there's no wax that penetrates into the motor. Now, one of the things that you want to make sure is that you don't put too much tape on the motors, that they will no longer fit inside the canisters. And the easiest way to check that is to take your finished tape motor and make sure that it falls in and out of the canister. Once that's done, move on to your next motor and get all three motors completely wrapped. Now that we have our motors wrapped up, we'll need to hook our tether cable to each of the motors. So what we'll need to do is open up the Cat 5 cable to get access to the wires. You only need to open it up a little bit at first, and in here you'll see that there are a blue and white pair, an orange and white pair, a green and white pair, and a brown and white pair. And then there's a string that runs along the inside. In order to cut back the rest of the sheath, grab onto the string and pull it back. And you want to clear about a foot, and that will allow you to peel back the outer cover. Once you get it peeled back, take your pair of scissors and just trim off the excess. Now, the Sea Perch only uses 3 of these sets of wires. We utilize the blue, the green, and the orange, and the brown is not used. We do recommend that you keep it for future use. If you ever want to add lights or anything else, it's a nice set of wires to have that you don't have to run another set. Now, each of these pairs will be hooked to one of the motors. So what we'll need to do is open up the wires so that we can get access to each of the 2 wires and strip off some of the covering using a wire stripper. You only need about a 1/4 inch of the wire exposed to solder them to the motors. All right, so we now have all 3 pairs stripped and ready to be connected to the motors. Now, the one thing we need to do before we do that is to take each of our film canisters and put a hole in the bottom for the motor so that the shaft can come out through, and a hole in the top to allow the wires to go in. To do that, pick up your film canister and you'll feel that both on the top and the bottom there's a little rough nub that sits on the canister. Go ahead and, using a fingernail, scratch that off top and bottom. That's important to do because in order to drill a hole in the center, you need to kind of go in the crater that you just created by ripping that off. Using the 3/32 drill bit, we will go ahead and drill the canisters both in the top and bottom. Okay. Do that for all 3 canisters, and then we can go ahead and pass the wires through the cap and then solder the wires onto our motors. Once you have your canisters drilled out, both on the tops and the bottoms, what we want to do is check each one to make sure that the motors fit inside without binding. A way to check that is take your motors upside down, put them in the canister. If the canister comes up with the motor, we need to make the hole a little larger. You can use the larger 1/8 bit if you need to open up that hole. Now that we have all of our canisters that we've checked, okay, we'll make sure that we feed our tops through the wires, or the wires through the tops, to make sure that they will be placed inside once we get the motors connected. If you remember, on each of these motors we use the marker to mark the positive pole. So what we will do is take the solid colored wire, whether it be blue, green, or orange, and connect that to the marked terminal just by placing it through and folding it over. And do the same thing with the other wire through the other terminal. And then you'll have them connected and ready to be soldered. And we'll do that now for all 3 of the motors. Once all the wires are connected, we're ready to solder these connections. So you take your soldering iron and solder. Go ahead and solder up each of these connections.